We're going to talk about critical parts, spare parts management, and inventory in general. It's a interesting topic because depending on whether you're in manufacturing or run a facility, it makes a difference in how you view spare parts. A lot of people in the facilities business say, well, I just need some filters and some belts on hand because everything else is taken care of. People in manufacturing, of course, have a much more complex situation. They have millions of dollars potentially invested in spare parts, and it becomes a much more complex process to control it. So we're going to talk about that today, and I'm going to primarily focus on the manufacturing side. But one of the things I want you to keep in mind, whether you're in manufacturing or facilities, with today's global marketplace and the potential, like we're experiencing, for disruption of product and parts flow, we need to take stock of what do we really need on hand and how much do we need on hand for a period of time, whether you're getting parts from Europe or the Middle East or the Far East, can have an effect not only on whether you can get the part or not, but when you can get the part and what the lead time potentially could be. So a lot of things are changing in today's global world, and we'll talk about that. So it's a responsible thing to manage your spare parts inventory. We have clients that have gone through 5S training and organized and gotten their parts in the right kind of shape. You know, each part should be in a little bit of a bin or area that's specific to that part only. Having a barcode on the shelf or a QR code, which is better today, on the shelf is really nice. Some people even go to the point of labeling each part with a barcode on the shelf. And again, depending on your business, depending on how much inventory you have, will depend on what effort that's going to take. I have clients that have full-time storeroom keepers, and they get the work order, and they did a couple of days before the part is going to be needed on the work order. It gets allocated, it gets pulled. A copy of the part gets added to the work order. So if it's a PM, they have everything ready for the technician, ready to go. They'll use a white pen potentially and actually put the work order number or the date that the work order is triggered on the belt, so that in the future, if a belt breaks, the technician knows how long that belt's been on the particular motor, pulley, or whatever. So there's a lot that goes into managing spare parts. It's not just, oh, we need some on hand. It's where are they, who can find them, and I'm working with clients right now that have major spare parts issues, and they don't know where those parts possibly are. When a technician has to spend time looking for parts, sometimes it's easier to call Home Depot and get something, and now you've not only have the part somewhere on hand, but you've bought it again. And the other thing that you need to manage on spare parts is the age of the part. If I have a case of caulk and I don't use it for 5 years, it's probably not any good, right? So knowing how long you've kept that part on the shelf is another critical component. And we'll talk about some of that a little bit later. What is a critical spare part? Well, that's changing in today's world, right? We know what our critical assets are. They're pretty easy to identify. They're part of our production operation or keeping our building running and healthy. So we know what they are in terms of the assets. But what are the critical spare parts? Sometimes it's the one that we haven't identified and don't know how long it's going to take to get because it very rarely breaks, right? We're going to run into those situations from time to time. Um, but on the other hand, there are parts that are used consistently and constantly, whether it's a motor you have to change out from time to time, or it's belts you replace from time to time. Uh, they're they're fairly consistent and easy to identify. If you're using them in a PM process, as an example, they're definitely easy to identify. If they're an occasionally used part, it becomes a little more difficult. So again, being able to analyze your parts usage and project parts forward um, during a time period, depending on the lead time for parts, how much area you have to store it, are all things that, and we'll talk about a CMMS. Those are all things that a good tool like our CMMS will provide for you. Okay. I'm looking at the picture that we put on the PowerPoint, and it's missing barcodes or QR codes, right? Something that, again, in today's world, we're going to think about in the organization of our parts and our review of critical spare parts. It's one thing to have a spare part and have it on hand, but it's another thing that you have to actually end up taking time to take care of that stored part. What do I mean? Well, if I have a gearbox and it's a critical spare part and I put it on a shelf and it sits there for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years potentially before I need it, and that happens in a lot of situations, if I don't turn that part frequently, it may be as defective as the part that I'm pulling out of the production area. In other words, the vibration, the draining of the grease to a single side in a gearbox, or the same thing with a motor and the shaft as it sits on a shelf. There is constant vibration, and that vibration could render that particular part useless. Our example of the caulking tubes. It's always cheaper to buy a case of caulk than to buy a couple of tubes. So people do that, but we need to know how long is it sitting on the shelf, because when I go to find it, and I do find it, it may not be any good. So there's time that needs to be invested in actually taking care of the parts that you are buying and storing. People don't think about that enough. They don't have time to take care of the parts they've bought, and yet it's difficult situation to take a motor that maybe costs $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, and not take care of it, even though it's not being used. So think about that, and think about how are you taking care of your spare parts if you can find them, right? Oh, going back, one other thing, the damage. If we don't store parts in an organized fashion, they can become damaged before we even get them off the shelf. And again, our 5S process and making sure that parts are stored well, stored safely, and stored in such a manner that they don't get damaged in the process is something that you all need to think about. My favorite, obsolete parts. If I've got 4, 5, 6, 7 locations, it's hard to identify if the part is really obsolete or not. And the reason is, if I identify it that it might be obsolete in my facility because the particular piece of equipment I bought that part for has been replaced and upgraded, I don't know if I don't have a good tool, I don't know if other facilities are using that part or not. Today, the availability and the ability to view stock utilization in all of my plants is an absolutely critical requirement. Number one, that ability allows me to stock less parts from a critical part and on-hand parts standpoint, particularly if all of my plants are in the U.S. or U.S. and Mexico and Canada. Right now, it's easy to transfer parts between plants. If I'm worldwide, that becomes a little more difficult. And we have clients in both categories. But finding spare parts, I did a 5S exercise with a client a number of years ago, and I found a 3-inch copper T. And a copper T, 3-inch, maybe it was a 4-inch, couple, $125 or something like that. I asked the manager of the facility, do you have any of these on hand? And he said, no, I would never have anything like that. And I said, well, why do we have this? And he was sort of surprised. And it was a humorous situation. It wasn't done in a negative way. But the point is that we have stuff sitting on our shelves, and we need to know what is it and where is it, right? Goes back to the basics of knowing where my parts are so that when a technician needs to find it, they know where to go to get it. When you have the wrong part or an obsolete part, it can lead to additional downtime. If there's been modifications or upgrades made to a piece of equipment and you're putting an obsolete part on it, thinking you're doing the right thing, it can cause more problems than you want to imagine. So it's absolutely critical to organize your spare parts and know in your facility, is this part obsolete or not? And if it's obsolete in my facility, is another location able to use that? Now, the question becomes, do they have enough already? What do I do with it? Do I red tag it and eliminate it or sell it for scrap, or what do I do, correct? And those are decisions that if you're well organized, you'll be able to make fairly easily. So let's talk about multiple inventory locations. You need a tool. You need a communication vehicle, whether it's a single database of inventory at locations or the ability to view a database at other locations. Today, with the cost of parts and the competitiveness of staying up, staying productive, and keeping my investment in parts as minimal as possible, yet keeping operational, you need a tool in place that's going to allow you to know where parts are available to your organization, right? It's all about making money, keeping the bottom line effective, and keeping parts in effective locations is all part of the process. So Eagle, of course, has a maintenance management software tool called Proteus. We offer all of the things to clients that we've been talking about, the ability to make use of a CMMS, to organize parts, to track parts, to know the age, how long it's been on the shelf, to know the lead time of parts, where you buy them from, what multiple part numbers are associated with whatever part number you call the part, right? There could be there's the manufacturer OEM part number. You may use a different part number, and 2 or 3 other suppliers have different part numbers. That just makes the whole part storage thing pretty complex. So if you have multiple facilities, you may come up with a standard of keeping the manufacturer's part number or the part number at a specific plant as the main part number. Again, these are all things around parts that you need to have as a part of your company's discussion, right? In the facility side, who supplies the parts to you? Do you get them from the vendor that does the maintenance, or do you buy the parts and the contractor or vendor that comes in to do the work pulls from your supply? I've seen that both ways in the facility marketplace. It's critical, again, to have processes and understanding of the parts, the age of the parts, where they are, how they're labeled, and the specifications and things like that as a part of your process. And again, a good maintenance software tool will allow you to get all of that information, in addition to be able to put attachments and specifications, quotes and things like that associated with the parts, so that you have good communication not only in your facility, but potentially between facilities. So how do you begin? Well, it's the old story of you take a step at a time, right? It's not potentially going to happen overnight. I've got clients I'm working with right now that are beginning to organize their parts, going through the initial 5S process of sorting and straightening and labeling and putting barcodes or QR codes on their parts. I've got other clients that have a corporate standard, it's documented, and it's being adhered to consistently throughout 20, 30 locations and enforced, okay? And you can go to the desktop and look at a part and see what locations have it, how many they have, how many are allocated to existing work orders, what the cost of that part was. It could be different, right? I may have bought a part and I needed to air freight it in as a spare, and you may have bought 3 parts and brought them in normal freight. Big cost difference in the parts that way. So again, keeping track of the value of the inventory, keeping track of where it is, what it is, how old it is, are all things that the tool that you use, your CMMS, should be providing you. We have a team of people that can go out and help you organize your parts, walk through a 5S exercise if you've never done it before. It takes about a week on site, and we work with the entire team and train them on parts organization, what 5S is, how to organize parts for your particular types of parts, and again, that's a service that Eagle provides. And if you do have any questions, my email is harryk@eaglecmms.com, and feel free to call me, email me at any time. If I don't have the answer to your question, I've got a team of experts. Thank you for your time today. A bunch of topics coming down the line, and we appreciate your time, and thank you very much.